Have you ever wondered, ever wondered?
Janine Shepard was an elite ski racer whose bid to represent Australia in the Olympics was cut short by a tragic accident. For 10 days, she hovered between life and death. After 6 months battling to rehabilitate her permanent disabilities, Janine taught herself to walk. Then she became a pilot and an aerobatics instructor. Janine is an internationally renowned speaker whose inspiring TED Talk, A Broken Body is Not a Broken Person, has been viewed over 2 million times. Janine has received Australia's highest honor, the Order of Australia, and is the best-selling author of 4 books. So thanks for joining me today as I speak with Janine about her latest work, Defiant, A Broken Body is Not a Broken Person.
Janine, I want to first of all say that when I first heard TEDx talk, and I was just weeping. It was so beautiful and it was so inspirational. And so I got your book, and it's one of the most inspirational stories, honestly, I've ever heard. I kept thinking, this woman is such a warrior. She is just a warrior. And I just was in awe of your strength and the way that you went through this incredible adversity, and you have come out to be a light to this world. So I want to start out by asking you about your story and have you tell us, maybe start before the accident and give us an overview of what happened.
Well, thank you, Colleen, for those kind words. The TED experience has been a seminal moment in my life, and I've learned a lot from that and connected with so many people, actually just doing that talk, which was a great experience. So going back to my life before the accident, I had a very stable life, which I was actually just reflecting on before I jumped online, that it was actually very important that I had that stability in my life because of what was about to come. I don't think I would have been equipped with the tools in my life to have been able to do the things I've done. So I had a very stable upbringing, a very supportive mum and dad. There was no great trauma in my life, no big trauma anyway. It was, I was an athlete, I did well at school, I just had, in terms of, we're talking about attachment theory, and I'm sure you know about that, I had a very stable attachment. I had parents that were there for me physically, emotionally, spiritually. I was at university, I had a boyfriend, I had great friends, I had a very stable life. I was studying to be an exercise physiologist, I was an athlete, I was in the Australian ski team, I was aiming for the Olympics. It was just a very stable life. And I really felt at that stage, I sort of had my life mapped out in front of me and had no idea what was about to happen.
And so can you tell us about the accident then?
So I was on a training bike ride with my teammates from the Australian ski team and some other friends, and we were riding our bikes from Sydney to the Blue Mountains, about a 6-hour ride. And I had actually not been feeling well leading up to that. I'd been overtraining. I had been to a doctor and had a condition very common to female athletes in overtraining. I don't think I'd had a period for about 6 months. I mean, I was very low body fat, my body, I guess, was under a lot of stress, which is something that a lot of female athletes do go through. And I almost didn't go on the ride because of that. I thought, I'm really tired. I shouldn't be going on this ride. And I had a friend coming up he came up from Victoria. And so I thought, I better go on this ride. And so I went on this ride, even though my body said, don't go on the ride. And about 5.5 hours into the ride, I remember thinking, I am so tired, and sort of getting up off my bike up a hill. And that moment changed my life. I was hit by a speeding truck with probably 10 minutes to go on the bike ride.
And so you woke up then, you were in the hospital at the point that you woke up, and tell us about, that experience, leaving your body and how that unfolded.
It's so interesting because it's very hard to put these experiences into words because they're not, some things just words can't really encapsulate the experience. I have no memory of the accident, but the doctor said I have post-traumatic amnesia. But the reason is I'd actually left my body. So while my body was on the ground and a lady drove past and saw something flying through the air, and that was me. She raced back and she said she's never seen anything. She had a friend actually get out of the car with her and run back to me, and the friend looked at me and was sick, just physically sick, just looking at me. So they were fighting they didn't know. They were just, someone had called the ambulance. And I actually years later met the ambulance driver or the paramedic that picked me up. So I'm telling you from his perspective what he saw because I don't remember it. So he was called, he came to me and he said he's never seen anything like it. And he said, she's not going to die on my watch. So they put me in the ambulance. They took me to the emergency department of the nearest hospital. A young doctor had just arrived from England, and in I come, a level of trauma that he's never seen before. And he said to the paramedic, Gary, his name is, he said, well, there's nothing we can do. She's basically going to die here. And this Gary, who's become a great friend, really said, I owe my life to him in so many ways. He actually thought, no. And he went down and he had a friend that was a surgeon in surgery at the time that I arrived. And he went in and he pulled the surgeon out of surgery and said, you have to see this girl. So he handed over to someone, came up to emergency, looked at me. He was a senior doctor, said to the young emergency doctor, basically, stand down. He said, right, get the helicopter up from Sydney, get the blood flown up, and just sort of took over. And had he not done that, I would have died in that emergency room that day. So the helicopter came, my parents were called up, hours they drove, they had no idea what to expect. And of course, my mum went into shock. She told me that the doctors offered to give her some sedation and she said, no, I need to know what's going on. Then they flew me down a couple of hours in a helicopter to a spinal ward in Sydney. For 10 days, I was in just another world. I mean, they told my parents that I'd lost 5 litres of blood, which is basically all someone my size would have. And they were pumping blood in. My blood pressure when I arrived at the hospital was 40 over nothing. I mean, I was as close to death as you could be. And they told my parents, we can't do anything else. Just basically say goodbye. And that was 10 days of that. My parents didn't leave the hospital. I have no idea what they were going through because I was just having my own experience, which is also difficult to put into words. Instead of thoughts, I think the only way that I tell people is it's like an awareness. I had an awareness. I can look back and I know when you're out of your body, you're not in a body, you're not thinking like a person. It's like this all-encompassing awareness or knowing that there's some sort of experience happening around you. And it was both incredibly painful, excruciating, and also liberating. It was as if one part of me was, you're staying, and the other part was, no, you're going. And I just remember this awareness of my body's broken. That can no longer serve me. I didn't want to go back to that body. Looking back now, I knew that there were people beside me, all around me, working on my body. My parents were sitting by my bed. My father was holding my hand. Now, my parents weren't, religious people, but there was a little chapel at the hospital. And my father at one point walked down. It was this beautiful real estate in Sydney, right on these cliffs and the ocean, and a little chapel sitting there. And my father went into this chapel and he told me much later that he sort of got down on his hands and knees and said, God, take my strength and give it to Janine. And looking back now, I realized that they were this lifeline for me, constantly for this 10 days, sitting by my bed, nobody left, holding my hand. I had people around me, people sitting on the grounds outside on the grass of the hospital. It was amazing. Just everybody sort of came together. And I think that was my lifeline. And really it was 10 days when the internal bleeding stopped. And that's really the time that the doctors said, okay, she's going to live. I remember opening my eyes and just confusion. What am I doing back here?
When you were in those 10 days, did you feel as though, a lot of near-death experience, people say, oh, I went to the other side, or did you feel like you were kind of still there? I know at one point you say in your book, Defiant, which is a fabulous book, that you were kind of given a choice to come back or not. Tell us about that period.
So I think from my experience, what I went through was I actually, it's sort of an odd thing to say, but there was no tunnel. There was just a room. I have a recollection of being in a room and seeing a sort of almost like watching a movie play out. If you go back, this is what your life will be. And I just remember it was all about, I knew that my body would be permanently disabled. I knew that I would have these challenges. It was really interesting because I knew that it was my choice. I didn't have to go back. No one was making me go back, yet I made that choice. That knowledge has been with me my entire life. When I came out of hospital, when I was recovering, there was always that knowing that I chose this. We all choose to come back. We all choose to be in this body. That knowledge gave me the strength to overcome some of the most difficult challenges of my life once I was home from hospital. It was my choice. I did choose to come back. And so even when I was home, I always thought, well, I better figure out why.
So you didn't know at the time that I'm going to come back for a certain reason. You just decided that was your journey. That was what you needed to do.
I always knew that I chose to come back, but I wasn't actually 100% sure. I mean, I thought I was. I thought, yes, I did choose to come back. But there was always that niggling part of me that thought, did I? Did I really choose to come back? And it's only recently with some deep inner work that I've been doing that I absolutely, without any doubt at all in my mind, I've been back and revisited that experience. And now I know. Had I known these things back then, I wouldn't have had the authentic experience of suffering and trauma that have enabled me to be able to connect with other people's grief and trauma.
And you have done that so exquisitely, beautifully well. I mean, you're just a light to this world. What a mission. What a reason to come back. You said in the book at one point, dear reader, you are not your body. That just has stuck with me I read your book over a year ago, but that beautiful sentence has stuck with me. And sometimes we forget that. We get so enmeshed in this experience that this is all there is, but we are more than our bodies. And you have been a real testament to that. When you were above your body, that realization hit you then? Tell me about that.
I really didn't understand where I am now, looking back. There was a lot of confusion. I mean, as I said, if I'd known back then, oh, okay, I've come back and had the knowledge that I feel like I have now since I've been doing this really deep inner work, I don't think that the struggle that I'd experienced in overcoming and coming to terms with even my disability would have the same power that it has now, because I wouldn't have gone through the fires, the initiation that I needed to go through to get to where I am now.
One of the most gripping parts of the book, and the whole book was fabulous, but was after you woke up and just your determination to walk again, and the whole year you were in a body cast. Can you tell us a little bit about that? That is just stunning, the way that you just had the internal strength to take that on.
Gosh, looking back now, sometimes I wonder how I did it. But I think, I am a very determined person. And I know you've asked me before about my life as an athlete. I think I'm extremely disciplined. And I felt like my recovery was like the Olympics. I just threw myself into it. And again, in that niggling in the back of my mind that you came back, you're going to figure out why. And so even when I was in hospital, I remember when they first got me out of bed, they took me to the rehab unit at the hospital. And I remember them laughing and joking with me, saying that all the OTs, occupational therapists and the physios at the hospital were really worried because they knew I was coming down, and they knew, this athlete's coming down, and oh gosh, And I just remember it was so difficult, so challenging. Even the first time that they took me down to the rehab unit in my wheelchair, and the physios stood me up between some walking bars. And it's going to make me cry. And mum came to hospital that day, and it's the first time in the whole since my accident that she'd seen me upright. And I remember she looked at me and I looked at her, and we both just cried. And I was so thin. I'd lost so much weight, covered in a plaster body cast. This athlete, this powerful athlete, standing, between these walking frames, and I had no idea the challenges that were in front of me at that time. I was just so determined. Probably I'm glad I didn't know. I remember when I was early on in the hospital, they had told Mum and Dad, don't tell her all of her injuries because she'll give up. Because I had so many injuries, and they said when she's ready, she'll ask. And I feel like that was a really important part of my recovery, had I known how difficult it was going to be. And I had so many things. It wasn't just learning to walk, which is a small part actually of spinal cord injury. There's so many more debilitating aspects of spinal cord injury. It affects every part of your life, the loss of sensation, the bladder and bowel dysfunction, chronic pain, which brings on depression. And I mean, there's so many aspects of spinal cord injury. I had to learn to use a catheter and self-catheter. And I remember thinking, unless I learn this, I'll never be able to go outside. I'll never be independent. And so walking is just a very small part of spinal cord injury. But I didn't know that at the time. I really had no idea of the challenges that were laid out in front of me.
But you took them on. You were just determined. They said, you probably wouldn't walk again. And you had decided, I'm going to walk again. And just the human spirit there is just astounding, the way that you, step by step, the painful process of just pushing your body day by day. And so how long were you in the rehabilitation section of the hospital?
Well, I was in hospital for almost 6 months, and most of that was flat on my back. And then I got home. When I was in hospital, it was, of course, a very challenging time being in a spinal unit. But I was surrounded by other people that had injuries, and friends and family were there. But when I got home and I was on my own in my bedroom and everyone went back to their lives, it really, really hit me. And I remember the head nurse at the hospital saying, just get ready. You're going to get really depressed, and thinking, no, I'm just going to learn to walk. I'm going to get my life back. And it really did hit me like a ton of bricks. I got home and it was just quiet, from all the noise and the, activity in the hospital. There I was home with a broken body in a wheelchair and having to learn to use a catheter and what would I do with my life? And it really hit me then. And I remember thinking, I don't want to be here. I do not want to be here. And it was a very dark time. I remember Mum sitting on the end of my bed and we were both crying. And my mum actually said, I wonder if life will ever be good again.
Oh.
I thought, how can it? Because the man that ran me over, by the way, who was charged with negligent driving and got an $80 fine, never came to see me. And there was a big lesson there in forgiveness as well and letting go. And it really got to the point where I thought, you have a choice. You chose to come back, so you're going to find out why. And the only way to do this is to let go of the life you had and any dreams or thoughts or identity as an athlete. And I really did, I made that decision and I let go. And I always say that life, you can't cherry pick in life. You can't go, I'm only going to take the good bits. You got to take it all. So it was in the letting go that really life came back and said, okay, so now we're going to begin. Now the work begins. And I had this new, it was almost like being given new eyes. And that, of course, was a moment that changed my life when I was sitting outside and an aeroplane flew over and I looked up and thought, okay, well, if I can't walk, then maybe I can fly. And it seemed ridiculous. Even looking back now, I cannot believe how on earth where did that come from? And I don't think I found flying. I think flying found me.
And that's a beautiful part of the book where you not only learn to fly and that whole experience, they had to completely rejigger the planes so that you could use the things that maybe sometimes you use with your feet. Tell us about becoming an aerobatic.
Well, I know it's crazy. I mean, when I turned up at the airport being held up in a plaster body cast, I'm sure they thought this is ridiculous, and they took me for a trial flight and they thought they'd never see me again. And it was like something inside me ignited. I was like, I'm going to do this. I'm going to learn to fly. And flying saved my life. It was a spark. I can do this. I had no idea. I mean, how would I even pass the medical? But now I had a goal. Now I had something to get up out of, to get out of bed for every day. And I just put my head down and studied and got the books and, eventually got passed for my pilot's license. And I exercised and I started to walk, 2 people holding me up, 1 person holding me up. And, Mum took me to the pool, put me in the water and I'd swim. And, eventually I did get my private pilot's license. I mean, let's fast forward. I got that. I got my night rating, my instrument rating, my instructor rating, my commercial pilot's license. And then I found myself back at that same school. I went for that first flight, teaching other people how to fly. And that was really in about a year and a half after I'd left the hospital. So it was such an extraordinary time of my life. And it really did show me that anything, if I can do this, I can do anything, and it wasn't just yes, physically it was incredibly challenging, but it was the emotional aspect of really having to push through the most painful psychological periods of my life. People looking at me, staring at me, thinking she'll never do this, and having to I was in and out of hospital having more surgery. I was having bladder and bowel accidents and having to learn to use a catheter. And it was just such an incredible time of my life that I really thought, if I can get through that, I can get through anything.
And your work today is an inspiration, I think, to people who think something's happened to them, I can't survive this. But your example of, like you said, the choices. I decided I'm going to be victorious over this. And tell us what you had children. You went on to have children. I mean, it's just such an incredible. Tell us about that.
Yeah. So I ended up marrying another flying instructor that I met at the airport, and the doctors didn't think I'd have kids because of the internal injuries. And I went on and had 3 amazing kids, which was, I just loved, I love being a mother. I've loved raising my kids. They've gone into 3 really interesting avenues in life. My eldest did psychology and neuroscience and writing kids' books and working as an AI researcher right now. My middle is an emergency doctor, and my youngest is an engineer. So they've all pursued really interesting avenues in life, and they've been my greatest teachers. So, I wrote my story, and in Australia, of course, it became very, well known. My first book was made into a movie, and that sort of launched me into the speaking circuit. And I started this journey of, telling my story. And the really wonderful thing, I love speaking. I love being on stage and sharing my story. It's been a really important part of my recovery, because what I realized is that when I was out telling my story, people would come up and share their story with me. And it really got me out of my story into a larger human story. And it really helped me understand that, I wasn't the only one going through this, that everyone had a story. And I always say when I speak, one of my favorite parts is when it's all over and I get to go and meet everybody, and whether I'm signing books or hugging people or hearing their story, but I feel like I'm a mirror. I'm holding up a mirror, and it gives them permission to share their story with me. And so I've heard so many incredible stories. People come up to me crying, wanting to tell me what they've been through or what their story is. And I feel it's a privilege.
And you've gone on to do some counseling degrees and work in counseling.
Well, I am trained as a counselor. I'm trained in, positive psychology. I finished my sports science degree. I've written a course on resilience, which is based on 12 steps, positive psychology interventions, which are the steps that I took in my own recovery. And actually, I'm 2 years into a PhD at the moment. So that actually morphed into something completely different because I'm really in the disability sector now. My university is very strong in disability rights and dignity. And so I found myself in a great place with a fantastic community of incredible people. And my PhD is actually, it was a mixed method. I was putting my course into spinal cord units, but now I'm actually doing an autoethnography, which not many people know what that is. It's a really interesting methodology of research, and where the researcher writes about their experience in the cultural context. So what I'm doing is I'm writing about what I went through and the choices that I made, what was happening culturally around that time in society, and why I made the choices that I did. And it's been a really interesting and also incredibly painful experience because I've had to go and really relive a lot of things. But it's been insightful, and it's given me the opportunity to look at my story and embrace with authenticity who I am and how I got here.
And is that what you were talking about? You've done some sort of deep dive into your past, and is that through that course or through that work?
Yeah, it's really about, I've looked at different experiences that I've had through, even my own sense of internal ableism, not being able to really embrace all of the aspects of myself. So there's a lot around identity and about authenticity and about, what does it mean to live with disability, and being able to say, I'm a proud disabled woman, and that's who I am. And I've done all this not despite it, but because of it. It's been a really interesting journey. And I think about, I love Brené Brown, and she has a quote around authenticity, which is not, what does she say? She says something about authenticity is not changing who you are, it's owning who you are. And I always think it's about not living as if, how you think life should be, but living in a way that says this is the way life is. And so, not trying to force something, but embracing what is and living with that and all aspects of ourselves too. And I think one of the big problems is when we try to fit in, and fitting in never works.
And I think just what you said, the owning of your story, it's like I lost my son. He was killed in Afghanistan. And until I came to the place where I said, this is my life, right? Okay, so my son didn't stay around to have children. I won't be a grandma. All those things that you can look at and say, what if? And you talk about that too. You have to let that go, release that. That isn't reality, isn't what your life is. You have to embrace your life and say, okay, what now? How am I going to make this story as beautiful as I can?
Yes, exactly right. So going from what ifs to what is. This is my life. So how do I choose to live it? And I'm looking at a board that's behind me right now of I've got all these little stories of the things that I've been through, and even the experiences that I've had in hospital, which were wonderful experiences. But, the message that I got in hospital was, don't be disabled because society judges you harshly. It's not that I deliberately tried to hide my disability, but it was something that I couldn't really embrace. I never thought of myself as having a disability. And as I'm getting older, it's much harder to hide it because, it's not that I just walk with a limp or I have an unusual gait. No, I'm a woman with a disability and I'm proud of it. So it's allowed me to connect in an authentic way with who I am, and also a really wonderful community of people with disability, which have been great mentors to me, who have teach me a lot about living with that every day.
I wanted to ask you, you're working with plant medicine in Australia and advisory panel to mind medicine in Australia. Tell us about that. That's fascinating to me.
It is fascinating. So Mind Medicine Australia is expanding the treatment options for mental illnesses in Australia and, of course, worldwide through research, development and ethical deployment of psychedelic-assisted psychotherapies. I'm really interested in trauma. I think that we all have trauma. Even if we're not really aware of it, whether it's large traumas like accidents or loss of loved ones or the smaller ones. I think the challenges that we all face today, there are so many challenges. We are bombarded with these things every single day. And mental illness is all around us and it's not working. We need to look at different options. And I think that psychedelic-assisted therapies, we know the science is in, the data is in, it works. Australia now has been approved for the use of psilocybin and MDMA for therapy. They're wonderful therapies for a lot of people. They get to the root of this. I mean, you can spend your whole life in talk therapy, and I've had a therapist most of my life, and I support talk therapy. But these therapies really, they're fast, they're effective, and I think that it's a great option for not everyone. But, if you're a suitable candidate, it's definitely something that I would encourage people to look into.
I've done some reading on veterans, PTSD, and how it'll get right, it gets right to the core of their fears, and seen some really amazing things with that therapy. So I'm hoping that it will get a rejuvenation here in the States too.
I think it is. I think it's happening. There are a lot of really smart people out there, a lot of neuroscientists, a lot of psychiatrists, a lot of psychologists doing the work, bringing out the data, the scientific papers. We know that it works. We only need to read books like, Bessel van der Kolk's The Body Keeps Score, to know that we need to look at different options for addressing particularly people who have treatment-resistant depression and anxiety and PTSD and MDMA, for example. And I'm talking about in a clinical setting. I'm not talking about party drugs. I'm talking about, you're in a room with two therapists, and there's a lot of integration happening. And what it gives is the opportunity to take the amygdala offline, to reduce the fight and flight reflex, and to heal these deep traumas. It's just crazy that these wonderful medicines have been in the past illegal. Well, they're now legal. We've legalized it, those two, at least in Australia, in a clinical setting with a psychiatrist. And it's the beginning. It's the beginning.
I would like to ask you, Janine, sort of in closing, what do you think is the purpose of your life? What do you, if you look back and with all the work you've done and all the incredible victories you've had, what do you think now was the purpose of all of that?
That is such a great question. And we talk a lot about purpose and meaning, and, I think a lot about that. I think the purpose of life is to find meaning. I think that's different for everybody. What creates meaning for you might not create meaning for me. So I think it's not the meaning of life, but the meaning in life that's important. And for me, learning, curiosity, speaking, giving back, being, I do a lot around strengths and values. And I'm a big fan of Joseph Campbell, the mythologist Joseph Campbell, who talks about the meaning of life. He says there's no ultimate, well, it depends, whatever you believe. There is a meaning or not, but he says it's to make your heartbeat match the heartbeat of nature, your nature with the nature of the universe. So I think, to me, that makes sense, to do the things that, as Joseph Campbell says, follow your bliss, that bring you joy. What are the things that bring you joy? And to do those things. And that creates meaning. And maybe that's the purpose of life.
I think that is so true, so true. So you're delightful. And like I said, you're a true light to this world, and your resilience is incredible. Bless all that you do. And I want to encourage everyone to go out, and Janine has 3 marvelous books, and I get all of them and read them. And I will have all the information at the end of this episode.
I am so happy that we finally got together and connected.
It's great. And it's perfect timing. It was actually perfect timing. So thank you again.
Thank you, Colleen. And we'll meet up either on your side of the world or my side of the world.
Thanks for joining me today for my interview with Janine Shepherd. If you'd like to know more about Janine's work, open my website at haveyoueverwonderedpodcast.com and tap into guests.
Have you ever wondered? Ever